September 23, 1991. A quiet road outside St. Cloud. The kind of place people drive through without looking twice. But that morning, 3 passing motorists noticed something strange in the grass beside Neptune Road. At first, it looked like discarded clothing. Then someone slowed down, and the truth became impossible to ignore. It was a body. A young woman lying just off the roadway, 27 years old. Her name was Julia Sue Wilbanks. She had been stabbed repeatedly, 17 times. Some wounds were deep enough to pierce vital organs. Whoever attacked her didn't just want her dead, they wanted certainty. Police quickly secured the scene, but almost immediately investigators realized something troubling. There were no witnesses, no obvious murder weapon, no clear explanation for why Julia had ended up there. The crime had happened quietly, and the person responsible had vanished just as quietly. What no one knew that day was that this case would remain unsolved for more than 3 decades. 33 years of silence, 33 years of waiting, 33 years before the name Jean Stuller would enter the investigation. Before she became a case file, Julia Wilbanks was simply a young woman living her life. She was 27 years old in 1991, a mother, someone with plans that stretched far beyond that September morning. Friends described her as determined, the kind of person who kept moving forward even when life wasn't easy. Like most people whose lives are suddenly cut short, Julia's story wasn't supposed to end violently. There were routines, responsibilities, people who expected to see her again. But at some point in the hours before her body was discovered, something changed. Somewhere between her last normal moment and the roadside where she was found, Julia crossed paths with someone who would end her life. And investigators were left trying to piece together the missing space between those 2 points. That space, the final hours of her life, would become the mystery. Police interviewed people connected to Julia, friends, family members, acquaintances, anyone who might have known where she had been or who she might have met. But every interview led to the same problem. There were no clear suspects, no one with a definitive motive. And without that starting point, the investigation stalled almost immediately. Let me ask you something. 17 stab wounds usually means rage or something deeply personal. So how does a crime like that happen in a small Florida community without anyone noticing the person responsible? And while you're thinking about that, if you enjoy true crime stories that uncover dark secrets years later, make sure you subscribe to Midnight Sin, because the next case might be even more disturbing. In 1991, forensic science had limits. DNA testing existed, but it was far from what it would become. Investigators collected evidence from the scene, clothing, biological traces, anything that might identify the person responsible. But technology couldn't give them the answer they needed. The evidence was preserved, stored, cataloged, and then the case entered the phase detectives dread most: waiting. Weeks passed, then months. Leads faded, witness memories blurred. The initial urgency slowly gave way to uncertainty, and eventually the case was placed in a category that carries a quiet kind of finality: cold. Cold cases are strange things. They aren't closed, they aren't forgotten. They simply exist in suspension, a question waiting for a future answer. For Julia's family, that meant living with a permanent gap in the story. Someone had taken her life, but no one could say who or why. Meanwhile, the person responsible continued living their life. At the time of Julia's death, a man named Jean Stuller lived nearby. But in 1991, investigators never connected him to the crime. Without a direct piece of evidence tying him to the scene, there was no reason to look deeper. So Stuller remained invisible to the investigation. Years passed.
He aged. Neighbors later described him as friendly, approachable, someone who seemed completely ordinary. And that's often the unsettling part of cases like this. There's no dramatic transformation, no obvious shift from normal life into darkness, just a person moving through the years like everyone else. But evidence has a strange way of waiting. Sometimes it waits decades. By the early 2000s, forensic science had advanced dramatically. DNA testing was more precise, databases had expanded, and investigators across the country began reopening cold cases that once seemed impossible to solve. Eventually, Julia Wilbanks' case returned to active review. Detectives re-examined the evidence. They sent preserved samples for modern DNA testing. This time, the results were different. A genetic profile emerged, but it still didn't match anyone in the criminal databases, which meant the killer had likely never been arrested for another serious crime. For some investigations, that's where the trail ends, but new methods were beginning to appear. One of them would change everything. In recent years, investigators began using a technique known as genetic genealogy. Instead of searching for a direct match, this method compares crime scene DNA to distant relatives who have uploaded their DNA to public genealogy databases. The result isn't an immediate suspect. It's something more subtle, a family tree. Investigators slowly work backward through generations of relatives, narrowing the possibilities until only a few individuals remain. It's painstaking work. Sometimes it takes months, sometimes years. But in the case of Julia Wilbanks, the method eventually pointed investigators toward one name, Gene Stuller. Now detectives had a direction, but they still needed confirmation, and confirmation requires one crucial piece of evidence, a DNA sample from the suspect himself. Investigators couldn't simply demand DNA. They needed to obtain it legally, so they waited. Surveillance teams observed Stuller. They watched for the moment when he might discard something containing his DNA, a drink, a straw, a piece of trash. Eventually, that moment came. A discarded item was collected and sent for testing. Inside the laboratory, scientists compared the DNA from that object to the DNA preserved from the 1991 crime scene. The result was overwhelming. The probability that the DNA belonged to someone other than Gene Stuller was astronomically small. After 33 years, the case finally had a name attached to it. Imagine believing you escaped justice for decades. Then one day, police knock on your door, not because someone talked, but because technology finally caught up. Stories like this remind us that time doesn't always protect the guilty. And if you want more true crime stories like this one, make sure you subscribe to Midnight Sin. In April 2025, law enforcement officers arrived at Stuller's home. By then, he was 72 years old, decades older than he had been when Julia Wilbanks died. But time doesn't erase evidence, and it doesn't erase responsibility. Stuller was arrested and charged in connection with the murder. For investigators who had spent years revisiting the case, the moment carried weight, because cold cases rarely end with certainty, but this one finally had an answer. 33 years is a long time. It's long enough for lives to change completely, for memories to fade, for communities to move on. But for families, the passage of time doesn't soften the question of what happened. It simply stretches the distance between the crime and the answer. In cases like Julia Wilbanks, justice arrives late, but late is still better than never, because every solved case restores something important, not just accountability, but truth. Some killers believe time protects them. They believe if they stay quiet long enough, the evidence will disappear, witnesses will forget, investigators will move on. But the world has changed. DNA doesn't forget. Technology keeps advancing, and the smallest trace left behind can remain silent for decades, until one day it finally speaks. For 33 years, the name Julia Sue Wilbanks existed as an unanswered question. Now it exists as something else, a case that refused to be buried.
and a reminder that sometimes the truth doesn't fade with time. It waits. Thank you for watching Midnight Sin, and if you subscribed during this story, thank you for supporting the channel, because every story we tell helps bring forgotten cases back into the light. Until the next one, stay curious.